Let us talk, first of all, as we get started, we are going to talk about why I think that church staffing, whether you are a church that's looking to hire or whether you are a church staff person that's looking to make a transition, there are some really crucial crossroads that are happening in this year, and we've been seeing happening for the last few years that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about and unpack 7 pressure points that I think are draining the church staff pipeline. We're going to talk about how these pressures impact both churches and individual staff members. We're going to talk about how most candidates and churches get stuck in their hiring and how to avoid some of those mistakes. And we'll finish up with some next steps that everybody can take to help prepare for their future. First things first, how long is this webinar? We're going to go, hopefully the content will be about 35 minutes or so. If I keep moving, it might feel like it's drinking out of a fire hose for a little bit, and then we'll do some Q&A at the end. If you have questions on this topic of church staff, pipeline, hiring, looking for work, all that kind of thing, but also you get to hear some off-the-cuff answers because I'm seeing the questions for the first time, so it's always fun. Why should I stay till the end? I've got a special offer at the end. I've got a special download for you and some special announcements for you if you stay till the very end, okay? And then finally, who the heck are you? I'm glad you asked. My name's Todd. A lot of you know me. I'm the co-founder over at chemistrystaffing.com. I've been doing church and ministry work for about 30 years. A lot of that has been helping pastors and churches navigate a transition in staff issues. And I'm really passionate about helping churches have a really healthy staff. Okay, that's my passion. I'm the original founder over at churchstaffing.com. Started that. The website has been 25 years ago. It's hard to believe it's been a quarter of a century. And I'm one of the co-founders over at Chemistry Staffing. I also host the Healthy Church Staff podcast, 5 to 7 minutes every day, Monday through Friday, where I share insights on leadership and staff and all that. And I'm also the author of a couple books, Silent Alarm and When the Church Falls. And I'll tell you about those at the end. Matter of fact, Silent Alarm is the name of the book. It just came out this week. My first book. I'm really excited about it. I'm not trying to be a book huckster here at all, but I'm really excited. What I've done and what we're going to talk about today is I'm trying to take some things that I have a very unique seat in my position at Chemistry Staffing to where we're working with, I think, about 80 churches. We're doing about 80 simultaneous staff searches with a bunch of different churches, almost 80 churches. There's a couple of duplicates in there that are doing more than one search right now, but a ton of churches. And I get to see some trends that maybe if you're just at one church or you're just hiring a few times over a few years, you don't get to see the trends. So we're going to talk about some of the trends today. And here's the big idea for the webinar today. I want to talk a little bit about the leadership crisis. Okay. And you might be saying, Todd, I didn't even know there was a crisis. Well, we're going to talk about it a little bit today on the webinar. And let me just paint the 30,000 picture of what we're going to talk about. Okay. The church staff pipeline in America is shrinking faster than what we realize. And we're entering, I think, a leadership shortage in the church, unlike anything that we've seen in recent decades. And if we don't take some intentional action, starting now, many churches won't be well enough equipped, won't have enough equipped leaders to meet the needs of their communities and their congregation. So that's what we're going to unpack today. It sounds doom and gloom, but there's some hope here too. So I want to share some of that with you as well. But we're going to unpack why it's happening and what we can do about it. This isn't like one big event. This isn't boom or clap of thunder or anything, and all of a sudden all the leaders are gone. This is not like that at all. This is a slow, quiet decline in the number of leaders that we've seen. And how this shows up in churches, we're going to talk about a little bit, but churches are starting to feel the effects. But many churches, because it's quietly happening behind the scenes, many churches aren't yet seeing the root causes. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And this is what I put in my book called Silent Alarm. The book Silent Alarm pulls back the curtain on some of what we're seeing at Chemistry and on how the pipeline is dwindling here a little bit. So we're going to look at those forces. We're going to look at what you can do to respond. So let's start with what in the world is happening. The leadership shortage isn't happening just in one place. The leadership shortage is not happening in one place. It's actually much more systemic. Multiple parts of the pipeline, the church staff pipeline, how churches find their next staff member, available people in ministry that call full-time ministry and calling what they want to do with their life. All of that is starting to fail at different levels all at the same time. It has been happening. It's happened a lot. It's really sped up in the last 5 years since COVID. But this has been happening for the last generation. I would say at least the last 20 or 25 years. And COVID just only accelerated the process. So there are certain different areas where the breakdown, where we can start to see the breakdown. And maybe you're starting to see this, maybe in some of these breakdown areas. In some of the other areas, maybe you're not yet seeing it yet, but I'm telling you, this is what's happening overall in the country and in the ministry, vocational ministry landscape. All right, the first breakdown point is the local church. So many churches, most churches, I probably could say, have really no intentional leadership development plan. So staff roles, if you look at church staff and how a lot of churches are hiring, they're a lot of times hiring reactively, not strategically. So how that happens, you have your youth pastor resign, we need another youth pastor. You have your worship guy or gal resign, we need to fill that role. So you're being reactive, not strategic. And that's part of the breakdown. Succession planning it's picking up a little bit. There are more churches that are at least having a succession planning conversation because it's acceptable now to do, and that's a good thing. But still, overall, succession planning is rare in a lot of churches, and that means that there are fewer ready now leaders to kind of step in. And many pastors just aren't mentoring young leaders like they once did. So the problem, breakdown number one, is at the local church level. Breakdown number two, take it beyond the local church, there's been a problem with seminaries and Bible colleges. And this enrollment is down at almost nearly every evangelical seminary. Some have closed. Seminaries and even Christian colleges are having a rough time right now, even just keeping their doors open. But enrollment is down, and fewer people are pursuing ministry degrees these days than what there were even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but especially 25 years ago. And on top of that, rising tuition, expensive, student debt is we talk to candidates all the time that are $75,000, $100,000, $125,000, carrying $125,000 of student debt. And that's really hard to pay off when you're working at a church or when you're in vocational ministry. So rising tuition is absolutely, and then theological schools, because of all of this, they're just graduating fewer candidates than they ever have before. So that means less seminary graduates, so less people coming out to fill the pipeline that churches are looking for. It goes even beyond the church. It goes beyond our theological institutions and seminaries. There's a breakdown as well going on. It has been for a generation, at least a generation, in our denominations and networks. So denominational pipelines once fed churches and trained pastors. It used to be if you had an opening for a senior pastor, you called your district superintendent, or you called your denominational person, and they had a list. They had kind of this list that they had of all the pastors that could possibly come to your church. And a lot of times, if you call the denominations now, they don't have a list anymore because the pipeline has diminished so much. And on top of that, many denominations are shrinking, they're merging, they're restructuring all of their systems, and some of those support systems for young leaders that a lot of denominations used to have programs to build into and train young leaders, they just either weakened or they've disappeared altogether. So the bottom line is that churches a lot of times can no longer rely on their networks to supply candidates anymore as well. Like I said, it's systemic, and over time, when you have the supply line kind of drying up at the local and the educational and the denominational levels, the leadership shortage There's just no way around it. It becomes inevitable. So we're going to look at, I told you a little bit about at the beginning, we're going to talk about 7 pressure points that kind of cause this. And I know if you're thinking, Todd, this is just all doom and gloom. Again, I promise we're going to get to some good stuff at the end, some ways that we can turn this around a little bit. Okay. But the first pressure point, I'm going to run through these really quickly. I want to save plenty of time for Q&A at the end. But the pressure point number 1, that's, again, drilling in from the 30,000 foot level on down, with some of the things that are really starting to cause all of this that we're talking about with the shrinking pipeline and leadership bench that a lot of churches are having and seeing these days. Number 1 is just declining calling. There's fewer young adults that are sensing a call to ministry. And because of that, the recruiting pool is shrinking even before churches start hiring. So this is maybe one of the first places where your church is going to sense that, ooh, something's different here. And it's going to be when you go to hire a new pastor. Maybe it's a senior pastor, maybe it's a youth pastor, children, executive pastor, whatever. You're going to find that if you did the same search 5 years ago, the candidate pool has shrunk. And that's because there's fewer young adults coming in. And we're going to talk about some of the other pressure points here. But the first one is there's just fewer people being called to ministry. And what it means for you is when you do a staff search at your church, competition for healthy candidates is increasing. Okay. It is very competitive out there. We just talked about pressure point number 2, the seminary slowdown. Okay. The seminary and Bible college enrollment has dropped significantly. There's fewer formally trained leaders that are coming out of those colleges and universities and theological seminaries. There's less graduates, which means fewer formally trained leaders entering the workplace. So again, if you're a church, what this means is that if you're looking for a candidate with an MDiv or a DMin, there are fewer formally trained candidates. And it's causing churches that haven't hired for a little while to kind of shake their head and say, what happened? What happened to everything? And then churches can't assume that supply will meet demand, because right now, and this has been the case for the last 5 years since the pandemic, there is more demand than there is supply. So there are more churches right now that are hiring than what there are really good candidates out there to fill the roles that are open. Okay, so that's pressure point number 2. Pressure point number 3, we've also seen this kind of skyrocket in the past 5 years. And again, this is the perfect storm of what's happening. And if you're hiring and you're frustrated, these are the reasons I'm guessing that you're frustrated, because we talk to churches all the time and this is what they're telling us. Pressure point number 3, ministry is burnouts and exits. Ministry fatigue is at all-time highs. Expectations are often unsustainable. Expectations have always been high in churches, but since COVID, it seems that, man, the pressure's on, and there are too many pastors that are getting burned out. And bullet point there is too many pastors are just walking away from ministry entirely. We have seen a pretty dramatic number of people exit the ministry, and it's not the young folks and it's not the old folks. It's a lot of the mid-career people, the youth pastors with 5 to 10 years of experience that are just saying, I'm going to do something else right now because I'm tired. I'm tired. Tension, if you're leading a staff, retention is going to become, if it hasn't already for you, keeping the staff that you currently have happy and engaged and healthy is going to be just as urgent as recruitment, as finding new people to bring on your staff in the future, because it's going to be that much harder to find really good quality staff. Pressure point number 4 out of 7 is there's compensation gaps. So stagnant pay and rising costs, especially for younger families, has caused churches notoriously don't pay incredibly well, a lot of us, but it's been a perfect storm. It's been a lot of inflation, been a tightening housing market. It's been a lot, increasing prices everywhere. And if you are just starting a new staff search or replacing a staff member, the sticker shock of how much the market will bear for a new staff member is going to be really maybe shocking to you, because it's very expensive to hire staff these days just because of all the things that have happened in the economy and just the way things are going. So ministry positions at the old kind of rate have become increasingly unsustainable financially. And I mentioned the student loan debt, but especially for potential employees that have the seminary degree and are carrying the $80,000 or $100,000 in student loan debt. In the future, what that means is there's going to need to be some creative compensation solutions. And those are going to become, we're already starting to see churches become, they're either changing the rules themselves, or they're changing kind of some of the fundamentals as far as how they're compensating. Okay. That's pressure point number 4. Number 5, we talked about this a little bit as well, but the pipeline neglect, the fact that churches have underinvested in leadership development at a local church level and mentoring, is going to be a pain point and a pressure point for many churches. The lack of, I call them ready now leaders at every level, is continuing to increase. And that's why you need an intentional strategy to kind of raise up your own leaders. I mentioned in the book, I'll just throw this in here. This will be free for you. I mentioned in my generation, I just turned 61 this week. Happy birthday to me. But my generation, when I grew up, it was not uncommon for pastors and church leaders and deacons and elders to kind of look at young people and suggest to them full-time ministry. That's what was done with me. I was a worship pastor for about 15 years. And I started out of college. I went to college to get a degree, partially in worship ministry and communications. But that was one of the things I remember to this day, a pastor pulling me aside and asking me, have you ever thought about doing this full time? And I hadn't. But those kind of conversations were, at least for me growing up, and I went to college and we had the same type of thing happen at college. I went to a Christian college, but there was a missions conference where is God calling you into missions? Is God calling you into full-time ministry? And a lot of churches, not all churches, but a lot of churches, that whole kind of looking and encouraging young people to develop as leaders, not just discipleship, but develop as leaders, has just left our culture. So that's pressure point number 5, is just a lot of local churches, going back to what we talked about before. A lot of local churches just aren't taking time or prioritizing developing leaders and discipleship. Really, a lot of this pipeline problem is a discipleship issue. Okay, pressure point number 6, we're going to talk about cultural shifts. There's been a growing distrust of institutions, including the church. You guys know this, you read the headlines. And younger leaders are becoming more cautious about long-term ministry commitments and about where they want to work. So local churches need to rebuild trust and credibility and transparency and investment and accountability and safe environments. And you need to portray this and communicate this as you hire a new staff, because that's what they're looking for. They're not just looking for a job. They're looking for a place where they can bring their family. They're looking for a place that they can trust, a place that's credible, a place that's going to invest in them and hold them accountable and disciple them and mentor them. The people that are looking to come into church work or change church jobs are looking at different things now. You just have to be aware of that as well. And then the last one, pressure point number 7, is misalignment and mismatch. Too many candidates are leaving roles prematurely. And this is because there are just a lot of unhealthy church staffs out there. Unrealistic expectations. There are theological conflicts. There are unhealthy environments. And because of that, staff people are leaving. You really need to hire for alignment. You have to hire not just skills and abilities, not just personality, but you need to hire for that long-term alignment, both theologically and culturally, also for skills and abilities, absolutely, and for personality, to make sure that they're going to fit your team. Okay, so let's go a little bit and talk just really briefly about. I just lost my slides again. Let's talk really briefly about beyond the pressure points and how this is going to impact your church. Okay, this is the biggest way it's going to impact your church. If you've done a search recently, you might notice that it just goes slower than ever. And again, that's because of what we talked about: changing expectations, a shrinking candidate pipeline, There's more competition. There's decision fatigue. There's all of these post-pandemic ripple effects that are impacting the church. And it's really driving, on the other side of it, it's driving the talent scarcity and the retention struggles. So we talked about the broken leadership pipeline. We talked about how burnout is real. 4 in 10 pastors right now have considered quitting in the last 2 years. And I don't have the stat in front of me, but the number of pastors that are anticipating retirement in the next 5 years is absolutely frightening. As I wish I just thought of that, but I wish I would have had the stat here. But if everybody that says they're thinking about retiring in the next 5 years retires, the church in America is going to have a pretty big pipeline deficiency, because we don't have that many pastors to come in and even just to fill the places of those that are planning on retire. So we talked about the mismatch of expectations and how competitive the marketplace is and all those pandemic shifts, but it's really a perfect storm, if you would. Let's talk just for a second. Almost done here, and then I promise we'll get to your questions. If you're here and you're saying, Todd, I'm not hiring staff, but I'm looking maybe to make a transition in the next year. Let me encourage you. This is a great time to be a candidate because of everything that I've mentioned. There are many more churches right now that are hiring than what there are candidates. This is a great time to be looking. Opportunities are much more diverse. Since there are more candidates than opening, I can't say you can write your own ticket, but you can find a role at a church that maybe you have a little bit more input into what you're bringing to the table. Fit matters more than ever, so you need to make sure that you find some place that you really fit. And you do have a little bit of leverage, but you need to use it wisely. The strongest thing you can do is tell your story. And churches, I tell this to churches all the time, if you are hiring a candidate, more than anything, you want to hear their story. You want to know exactly what they're going through and what they're talking about. So if you are either a person that's looking for a job or you're a church that's hiring, here's my encouragement to you. The book gives a lot more ideas on this, but bottom line is you have to really start thinking about raising up leaders in your own church. Okay? Because here, if the Big C church in America doesn't start to turn this around, and we're already starting to see this, and I'm optimistic that we'll start to get this right. Christ loves his church, and the church is going to be just fine. But there are hiccups, and this is definitely one of the hiccups. Here's the problem if we don't start raising up leaders in our own churches, is that when you go to hire, we have outsourced our discipleship and our leadership training. And I am maybe partly to blame for this with the whole church staffing thing that started 25 years ago, because what church staffing, and I love church staffing and we use it all the time, and they're great friends of ours in chemistry staffing. But what has happened in the past 25, 30 years is that churches have largely outsourced their leadership development. And if we need a youth pastor, rather than, hey, we've been training up this really great youth person, what we've done instead is we go out and we find a youth pastor. And that's worked really well for the past 30 years. And it works really well until it doesn't, because we can't always expect that somebody else is going to train our next staff member. We have to start taking some responsibility at the local church level to start raising up our own leaders. Those volunteers that are high capacity leaders, maybe they're teaching school right now, maybe they're working at a car dealership, but man, they love students and they love Jesus, they love our church, and they've got tons of potential. Start mentoring those type of people, because you never know what's going to happen. Some of your best next staff members are probably right under your nose, but it's going to take a little bit. It's going to take a lot of work to be able to teach and to train up and to disciple and to train up youth pastors and worship pastors and children's pastors and executive pastors. But you're going to be in a much better position when you need somebody and you've got somebody sitting on your bench that you can pull up. Okay, let's go ahead and we will do some Q&A. All right. Here's one from Chris. I'm just going to take these randomly. I'll try and get through as many as we've got, but I've got a dozen here already. Matt asks, on average, how many applicants do you get for senior pastor, worship leaders, student pastors? All right. I'll give you the consultant answer. It depends. It depends. It depends on a lot of different factors. It depends on what position it is. It depends on what your location is. It depends on what denomination or what kind of tribe you are. It depends on your church size. It depends on the salary. It depends on a lot of different things. I just did a podcast. I just recorded one. It'll be out next week, I believe, talking about job descriptions and how important it is for job descriptions and job postings that you really, it's a first impression for your church, so that your job posting, the actual text that you put in your job posting determines how many you get. I can't give you a number. Sometimes it's as low as 10 or 20 for a role. Sometimes it's 100 to 150. It really varies. Now we get a few more because we're a search firm and we're doing tons of marketing everywhere, but that's what I'm hearing from local churches. Could be higher, could be lower, but I will say this, it's less than what it was 20 years ago. Back 20 years ago when we first started churchstaffing.com, I would get regular comments from churches saying, help me go through all of these resumes. I've got 200 resumes on my inbox. Let's see, what's your advice for negotiating a compensation to be a bit higher than, this is Chris's question, than what the current pay is for a position that you will be filling once the current youth pastor transitions? First of all, is the current youth pastor grossly underpaid? Is he about at scale? Are you asking for more than that? A lot of it's going to have to do with your skills and abilities and how long you've been there, and kind of the education and what you're bringing to the table as well. So I'm not sure that I can really answer that question, but there are some other things you can do non-compensation wise for some benefits things that I think I've done a few podcasts on that. Some non-compensation type benefits things that are really attractive, like more PTO and things like that. Dominic says, how long on average are you seeing placements taking, and what has shifted in the past 5 years? All right. I'm going to give you another consultant answer. It feels like I'm not being very helpful here. Here's one thing I know for sure. It is definitely taking longer now than it did 5 years ago. Searches are taking longer, again, because of everything we talked about, all those 30,000 foot, all the 7 things we talked about, all those pain points that we talked about early on are causing searches to go longer just because there's less viable candidates and there are more churches that are, it's the market right now. How long does it take? We have at Chemistry, I think our record is we closed a search in 2 weeks. That's happened once in 8 years. Okay. I can't give you an average. Again, there's so many different differentials into why that happens. Location, church size, what you're paying. If you're paying 100,000 or you're paying 35,000, that makes a difference. What I will say is that it takes longer than it did. And we're telling churches from start to finish, okay, from the moment that you say, hey, we need to hire this person until they're actually boots on the ground on a starting date, I would say plan for 6 to 18 months from start to finish, according to the position. Okay. That seems like really long, but I'm telling you, and that includes all the interviews and negotiations and doing all your marketing and everything at the front end. Very good. Can I talk about theological conflicts emerging across America? Faustin asked that. That's a little off topic, Faustin, probably for this webinar. That'd be a great webinar, though. Let me tell you, just as I'll rattle off the big buckets that we have, that we still see that come up in just about every search that we do. Egalitarian complementarian, women in ministry is still a big issue. Reformed Arminian theology is always a big issue. Spiritual gifts is still always a big issue for most churches. They want to know where you fall on spiritual gifts. And then some of the cultural things like LGBTQ issues. How do you handle the question of who gets to serve, who doesn't get to serve? All the cultural issues of those kind of things are what we're seeing. Those are the biggies, I would say. Let's see here. Philip asks a question about alignment. These are really good questions. How can you ensure a church and a candidate are aligned when both are putting on their best during an interview process? Philip says, I was hired as a youth pastor and had several new expectations and responsibilities dumped on me after just the first 1 to 2 months without other expectations being removed. That would never happen. I don't believe you, Philip. I'm just kidding. That happens all the time. This is a common story I've heard from other youth pastors. Absolutely. So you're really asking two different questions there. You're asking an alignment question and a job responsibilities question. Job responsibilities question, you just have to ask lots of questions on the front end. You need to ask exactly, what will I be doing? What will I not be doing? What's the scope of this? Now, can an employer, any employer, whether you work at a church or you work at a car dealership, can any employer call you in and say, we want you, you're the youth pastor, and I know you've only been here 6 weeks, but we want you to do all the youth stuff, and we want you to do communications, and we want you to clean the toilet on your way out at the end of the day. Can they do that? Yep. Should they do that? No. Do they do that? Yeah. So the more questions you can ask on the very front end are going to help, but they're not going to be the be all end all. You're just going to have to go with, you're going to have to get the vibe. Is this the kind of church that's going to load me up after they get me in? And one of the ways you can do that is talk to other staff. There are other staff members. You can talk to other staff members on the team and see what their experience is with the church. And a side note here, if you interview at a church and they isolate you from the other staff members, red flag. You need to be able to have open communications and ask questions of the current staff members as well. The other question you're asking, that's about expectations. The other question Philip's asking is about alignment. And what we use at Chemistry, just really quickly, and this isn't a sales pitch, this is what we feel that both the church and the candidate need to have in common for what we call a healthy long-term fit. And we're trying, when we work with churches and candidates, we're trying to find a place where both can serve together for at least 5 years or more, okay? And there's 5 different things that need to be in place. 4 of them we help churches and candidates assess for, and the 5th one is on between the candidate and the church. Very quickly, there has to be alignment on theology. You have to believe the same things, okay? At least the big bucket items, there has to be alignment, okay? So theology, we call it church culture and DNA. The philosophy of ministry type things you have to be in agreement on. Personality, are you going to be a good fit for their team? Does your personality mesh with theirs? And then skills and abilities, can you do the job? So you got theology, culture, personality, and skills and ability. Those are the 4 that we measure and that we kind of rate to try and bring churches together and make sure they're on the same page. Last one, the 5th one, is chemistry. That's why we call ourselves Chemistry Staffing. And that's really what you learn when you're boots on the ground, when you're on site, when you're sitting in the interview, when you're sitting across the table, when you're eating dinner, when you're sitting in the service, when you're talking to parishioners, when you're talking to other staff members. Is that chemistry there? Is this someplace you really want to serve? Is this someplace that they really want you to serve? Is this the town you want to send your kids to school in the place where you'd want your kids to meet their spouse? All of those kind of things are chemistry questions. And that's how I'm trying to fill a lot in just a couple minutes there, Philip, but that's how we kind of look at things as far as alignment goes with churches and the work that we do. Doug asked, many churches seem to be targeting a 35 to 45-year-old experienced minister as their lead pastor, which makes big time sense. Are there any who'd like to not experiment with the next young leader, but bring a veteran who could be on staff as a teacher, bridge gaps? Yeah, there's the pendulum kind of constantly goes, it'll go all the way over here, and then eventually it'll come back. I think we're on the way back. Okay. I think 5 years ago, I think pre-COVID, you're right, man, lots of churches wanted that 35 to 40-year-old as a senior pastor, youth over experience, because if you're going to reach young families, you got to have the young pastor. And sometimes that helps. But I think the pendulum is slowly coming back, not just for senior pastors, but worship and youth and all of that. We approach age as just a number. And we really encourage churches to really drill down and determine what they need, because if they decide that they just want a 35 to 40-year-old, they're going to miss out on the potential of a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge, a lot of ministry expertise. And I think the pendulum's starting to swing back. It's actually probably about halfway back, because it was way over here. 20 years ago, it was way over here. You weren't considered really a good senior pastor until you were probably 50, 55. because you had all of that experience, that ministry experience that you could bring to the table, all that biblical knowledge that you bring to the table. What are some of the first steps that a church can take? This is Adam that asked this, to build a pipeline for developing leaders and future staff positions. That's a really great question. In the book, I mentioned, I think this is the best idea, and it's not my idea. My friend Dave Ferguson from Community Church in Naperville, Illinois, talks about the initials ICNU, or ICNU. He talks about, as leaders, as church staff people, we need to have more what he calls ICNU conversations. And that's exactly what happened to me. I kind of tell my own story in the book about the bishop of our small denomination. We went out for lunch after he came to preach, and just went out to lunch, and I was probably, I don't know, late 20s at the time, worship pastor at a small church, part-time. And I remember the bishop of the denomination looked at me and said, "Todd, you're doing really great work." He said, "But you know what? I think God's got some really incredible stuff that he's going to do through you. And what you're doing now is just a drop in the bucket as to how God's going to use you." That was an ICNU conversation. He didn't have to have that conversation. And honestly, when he said that to me at 28, I said, that's nice. Whatever. Thanks for saying that. But those words stayed in my mind. And that conversation, I still remember. And what he has said has come to fruition in my life and in my ministry. I remember, I mentioned it earlier, a pastor that pulled me aside when I was a teenager and said, "Have you ever thought about doing this?" So I think, to answer your question, Adam, I think the very first place to start is, and you can do this at a staff meeting, if you're a senior pastor, if you're a staff member, you can do that. You don't have to be the senior pastor to do this. If you're a worship pastor and you've got a volunteer that has really, you think, just great potential as a leader, just start having some of these ICNU conversations with them. Hey, God's really given you a gift here. I saw the way that you led that devotional, or I saw the way that you led that song, or I saw the extra work that you did here. And have those conversations, and then start utilizing them give them some tasks, delegate some things to them, start discipling them spiritually. Yes, absolutely. But also start discipling them as a leader. Because I really think, and this is a weird thing for a guy that's co-founder of a staffing company, if all churches did this well, there would be very little need for a staffing company. Because when you needed a youth pastor, you'd have one. When you needed an executive pastor, you've probably got one or two that you've been working with behind this. You've had these ICNU conversations, and they may not be ready to go, but they're ready to mentor and kind of step into something that you might have. So that may be very idealistic, but those are things, that's one thing that you guys can start wherever you are, whatever position you're in, something that you can start today. Start identifying those people around you that you think potential in, and start having those ICNU conversations. Current examples of churches, ministries, and then we'll finish this up here, that are doing a great deal with this. I think there's some larger churches that are doing some great work with internships and residency programs. My church I'm in Ohio, so Cedar Creek Church near Toledo has a great residency program. Matter of fact, the lead pastor, Ben Snyder, there actually has been there. He just celebrated his 25th anniversary at the church, but he started as an intern, and he is now the lead pastor at a 7,000 member multi-campus church. And all of that started with those ICNU conversations and opportunities, intentional opportunities at the local church level to identify people and train people. Another great example of this that just sticks in my head since you asked is, and again, this is a really large church, and whether you like Andy Stanley or do Andy Stanley, I did a little test a couple years ago where I went to LinkedIn and looked at all of the staff members at North Point and their partner churches there in Atlanta. And you know what I found? It was really interesting. Very few of them had seminary degrees. You say, that's horrible, Todd. But very few of them had seminary degrees or Christian college degrees. Very few of them had church experience before they came to be on staff at North Point. But it's because they have such an intentionality about identifying great leaders and discipling them biblically, but also discipling them leadership wise. That's another church that we give an example. Okay, very good. I went a little long on the questions, but those are always fun. Now what? Let's talk about what next steps that you can take. There are more challenges, but there's more hope. Leadership shortage is real, but it's also very solvable. And churches that start now with those types of conversations are really you're going to have a strategic advantage. It's not going to happen overnight, but in the next years, next 3 to 5 years, or the next decade, you're going to be really well positioned. If you still have questions, you can always reach out to me, podcast@chemistrystaffing.com. And I read every email that comes in, try to answer every email that comes in as quickly as I can as well. All right. I hope this has been beneficial to you. Give us a couple of days. We'll get you the recording of this. If you have any questions for me, pop me an email there on your screen.